right, welcome everybody. It's great to have you back. Tonight, we are going to focus our conversation on the preferential option for the poor, which I have to say, of all the principles of Catholic social teaching, this principle is the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart. So I am particularly looking forward to our conversation tonight. So here's the plan for our conversation. I'd like to make a little bit of time to hear from you in terms of any other reflections or connections from the conversation last week on economic justice for all and the dignity of work and the rights of workers. I know especially we were a little rushed at the end, so if there was anything that I can help clarify, or if you wanted to contribute before we get started this session on the preferential option, I'm happy to make time for that. Then I'd like to hear from you to hear what it was like for you to sit with those two gospel stories I asked you to spend some time with, the story of the Samaritan in Luke's gospel and the judgment of nations in Matthew's gospel. And I think that'll be a good lead into trying to make sense of this principle, the preferential option for the poor. And as I mentioned, there's no fixed number of principles in Catholic social thought. I've seen it as few as 4, if you can believe it. Typically, most people cite between 7 and 9 principles, but there's, I think, a good argument to be made that there could be more than 10. And so I've tried to add a couple set of principles here and there. So if you remember, I added a principle of liberation a couple weeks back. And tonight, I really would like to make the case that the Catholic Church should make and add and be more explicit with a principle of racial justice that I think is well informed by this preferential option for the poor, the vulnerable, and the excluded. And then I'm hopeful we'll have time at the end for some of your insights, questions, and some conversation, and a look ahead to next week when we'll focus our conversation on the global common good and the principle of subsidiarity. All right, so.
Oh, that's next week.
How about reflections and connections from last time? Anything as you were thinking about the dignity of work or the rights of workers that came to the surface for you in the last couple of days?
One of the things I really resonated with me was when they talked about between the subject and the object. And I think if we can get that across in working areas, especially in Latin America, it's not so much how much you can produce, it's the worker, the dignity of the worker. And I think that's a point that has to be stressed. And the object is the work, but it's the subject is the worker, not the work.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia.
I think when we personally know how our goods come from, it's very hard for us to ignore like how much to pay and all that. I remember our baker. I mean, there was only one bakery when I was growing up in Sri Lanka. And he was so nice. He used to bake all the Christmas cakes for free because he knew like we all his, clients. So he used to do that for all of us. He treated us, he wanted the clients. So he treated us respectfully. And we also went to him to buy stuff. And we used to go to the seamstress to get our dress made. So everything that we used, we knew like who made them. So we cannot just treat people like objects, like, but it's here, there is such a distance between how we get things. So it's easy for us to like kind of treat people or not knowingly treat people badly,
Yeah, absolutely. When I teach Catholic social teaching to my students, I play for them a video clip from Norwegian TV where they sent 4 teenagers down to a sweatshop in Cambodia and actually meet people who sit behind a sewing machine and sew clothes for 12, 13, and 14 hours a day, which, fast fashion companies like H&M will turn around and sell for very cheap because they're paying these people pennies. And these Norwegian teenagers are just sobbing, looking at the working conditions and the people who do this 7 days a week, 365 days a year, no weekends, no days off for their birthday or holidays. I mean, their entire life is working in a garment factory. and they had no idea, and I, often have to ask my students, why do you think I have to try to find this clip from Norwegian TV, with English subtitles so that you can get a window into what these working conditions are like? And it's, just like you said, Prinika, it's, if these were the conditions in our neighborhood, or, the conditions for our aunts and uncles, we would be up in arms. But because they're for people who are on the other side of the planet, who we never see and never care about, never get to know or get a chance to care about, it really is hard, I think, for people to think about the slavery stitched into the fabric of our clothes, or the deplorable conditions of the migrant workers who produce and pick so much of the food that we eat. Because it's hidden from us, I think we're kind of insulated from the injustice that they experience, which is a really great lead-in to the conversation tonight on the preferential option for the poor, and what it means to really take this principle of Catholic social teaching seriously, and how to move people with this principle. I think I've said before, my friends who are attorneys say the greatest distance in human society is the 18 inches from your head to your heart, and it's really hard to get people to be moved. And so I think this principle, out of all of them, and I think maybe human dignity as well, but this principle really, there is an empathic dimension to the preferential option for the poor. And we're going to spend a little bit of time with some of the documents from the Latin American bishops, because I think they do this even better than some of the magisterial documents. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to add one thing about that. What Prinika said about it being in a place that's more distant from so many of us as consumers, and I think that's true. And then I also wonder, can we try to figure out, like even here in the U.S., in arguments about the minimum wage, like in New York, our minimum wage, it's not in the whole state. I don't even think it's in New York City. Our minimum wage is $15, and that's still only, it's $15 an hour, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks. You're still living at a poverty level. Mm-hmm. And but then people will say, well, people get paid what they're worth. And I realize I've heard that, but this week I've been thinking a lot about that and saying, no, yes, that is what we do. I mean, but we're wrong when we think it's not what they're worth. They're worth something inestimable. But what we're saying and missing is that it's not about the whole thing about who flips hamburgers and how much should they make. That's a big one, right? It's like the flipping the hamburgers isn't the thing. The human person doing the flipping is the point. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, I can even lose sight of that sometimes, not in the argument, and it's like, no, right. The value is not, I want the hamburger maybe, but the value is in the person is doing the work. Mm-hmm. That's where the value comes from.
Yeah, that connects well with what Cecilia shared about that relationship between the subject and the object. And too often we focus on the object of the work being done or the service being provided to us, and not enough on the subject, the sacrament of the divine in our midst, who is our neighbor. I always think of that line from C.S. Lewis: your neighbor next to the Blessed Sacrament is the holiest object presented to your senses. Mm. So even if they're flipping burgers, that is a sacrament of the divine presence and the divine power in our midst. We got to live as though the truth is true. Okay, so go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, don't you think part of the problem is, and I think this is why Francis is so big on the encounter. Mm-hmm. We don't meet people, all of our work is outsourced. So yes, you do have to find a film in Norway. And we don't see, and we don't have a personal encounter. Even stores are not what they were like when we were children. You go to the neighborhood, the butcher, the baker, the post office and stuff, and you see the same shopkeepers who know your parents. And we don't have any of that. We live in a very impersonal world, and I think that's not to be a dead horse, but that's the Pope's point. Until we begin to encounter people and see them, we're not going to really change.
Yeah, Maria, that you just said my book in a nutshell. The Ethics of Encounter, Christian Neighbor Love as a Practice of Solidarity. I think it's all about encounter. I don't think any of the principles of Catholic social teaching will ever find traction unless and until we really take that that call from Pope Francis seriously, to see ourselves as agents of this culture of encounter. Because I think, if we think about the person we are and our beliefs and values, so much of that has been shaped by the people we encounter. Encounter, actually, etymologically, it means to meet as an adversary, which I think is so interesting. But it's a good reminder that we never master other people, much less ourselves, for that matter. I mean, I've been married to my wife for 16 years. We've been together for 20 years, and she still remains a mystery to me, not because she's confusing or, it's any deficiency on her part. It's just that there's more to her than she's inexhaustible in the best way, that even spending 20 years of our life together, there's more to her than I can ever really know and understand. And I think that's true for ourselves, right? I think we're always on journeys of self-discovery, and we never fully arrive there. But it is that invitation to really think about the ways in which we either make ourselves available to encountering others, especially those on the margins, and also, who we seek out. And to your point, Maria, I think because we live in these homogenous lifestyle clusters, it is really easy for us to spend most of our lives just, surrounded by people who look like us, who think like us, who vote like us. And it makes it really hard for us to understand and appreciate what it's like to be someone other than me. So I often think about that culture of encounter, but also all the encounters that never happen, because we don't do what the Samaritan did, right? Like, we don't go out of our way and into the ditch. That encounter is only made possible because the Samaritan is willing to put his agenda on hold and respond to another person in need. We've got a couple more hands, so I'm happy to make time for your comments or questions before we turn to these biblical texts. So we'll start with you, Mary Beth.
No, I was just going to contribute, jump on to, I forget who it was, but the value of work tragically during the pandemic. We've become more aware of, like, for instance, the value of a delivery person has significantly increased, at least in Brooklyn during the pandemic, and childcare workers, for instance, also. But, I also had the opportunity to go to Cambodia because my niece was a volunteer in the Peace Corps, and she decided to remain there. I think she's been living there for 9 years. Wow. And not only, workers, have oppressive conditions, but many of the people are outsourced from Cambodia and then go to work in Malaysia. And I found that the whole dissolution of the family systems that are there are affected by their working as well. So it's much more than just that their work is diminished, that their whole culture is diminished as a result of the value of their work. But I just have to tag on to you too about, you were saying about encounter, and I was very, very touched by the article that you added about the preferential option for the poor and encounter, is because of, I do believe, for most, the average layperson, it does have, to do with opportunities to, make an encounter for those on the margins. At the end of my teaching career, actually, I think it is purely grace. I was working with, I think it's Kathleen. I worked with an ESL population. So as a result, I had lots of encounters with the undocumented and with foreign students. But then I ended up going in and working in the jail system with incarcerated teens. And, I never took a class in Catholic social teaching, but I want to tell you, the principles of Catholic social teaching I may not be able to name them, but I was able to see them. And what a grace in my life to be able to have those encounters. And, I know that your average person that, was the mother of 3 children or, was walking around, does not have that opportunity to engage at that level. And so I really feel blessed. And I was very taken by that article, more so than even reading the encyclicals, to be honest with you. But,
Sure.
so you're absolutely right. It's engagement and encounter, and it is a grace as opposed to just studying the theology.
Thanks so much, Mary Beth.
Okay.
Arlene and John?
Yeah, I was going to say, to reaffirm what everybody else is saying, but also, I guess, was it in one of the encyclicals, they talked about a family wage. Instead, we always keep on saying a minimum wage. What does that mean? That means nothing. A family wage is even better than saying a living wage, because you're not an individual, you're living in a family and you have to support your family. The other thought I had, and this is, I'm thinking more and more of this, is that as a church, we've spent so much time talking about charity instead of justice. We don't see these issues as justice issues. So charity to me seems like I don't have to do it. It's above and beyond. If I'm able to, then I can do it. If I have the time, et cetera, et cetera. But if you see it as an injustice, then I think you become more involved, and you have a responsibility to correct or to alleviate the injustice. This is not open for discussion. This is something I have to be involved in and have to do. But I think that we just spend too much time on the idea that this is charity. Even all these programs that, not to get political, but that the president is trying to get through with Build Back Better, all those issues are justice issues. Instead, the Congress acts like, well, maybe we can do this. Maybe we don't have to do it. Anyway, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, Arlene, you raised an important point, and something that I wanted to mention, because for Pope John Paul II, the preferential option for the poor is predominantly an act of charity, which I think to an English translation does sound optional, and that's not helped by the title, of this principle, the preferential option for the poor, where people think that this is, supererogatory. And so I did want to clarify for people that whenever the church talks about charity, we can't think of it as the unilateral aid or the supererogatory action or giving of someone's surplus, or even the pity that is connoted by that word in English. When the church uses the word charity, it's a translation of the Latin word caritas, which means love. And it is part of the obligation to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? Like this is the greatest command. And I would point out, I think I've mentioned already, in the Gospel of John, there's no command to love God. Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. So even though, Arlene, I agree with what you're saying, that we've kind of reduced this as some kind of optional consideration, as the church sees it, charity is that act of caritas, that self-giving love that in the tradition of Catholic social teaching goes back to Thomas Aquinas, who says that caritas is the effective willing the good of the other. So it's not romantic, it's not pitiful, it's not really that emotional. It is that self-giving that wills the good and takes effective action for the good of the other. And what I love about Aquinas is that for Aquinas, caritas is friendship with God. That when we love others, we become friends with God. And I think then we see a real clear connection to what Gustavo Gutierrez is saying, where he links together the preferential option, the Samaritan story, and friendship. And that's something that I'd like to spend more time with tonight. And then the other point I wanted to make is The word option, where we get preferential option for the poor, comes from the Latin word to will. Opt is to choose, to decide. So it's not an option, or it's not optional. This is how we choose. This is how we make judgments, and we do it on behalf of those who are in greatest need. And that'll be really the focus for tonight. Before we get there, Maria, you've been very patient.
Oh, yes. No, well, I just noticed in the earlier readings we were doing, there was repeated reference to man subjecting the earth to himself.
Mm-hmm.
And I see in Pope Francis writings and declarations, to the extent that I'm familiar with them, which is limited, but his emphasis seems to be much more on the cohesive whole,
Mm-hmm.
and all of God's creation and creatures working together. And maybe the language subject the earth to man
Mm-hmm.
is not intended in the way we tend to use the word subject today. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe, that was never the intent, but I almost find it offensive.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the shift to the focus on all of God's creation being equally created by God and working together.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I mean, there's a really famous article by Lynn White Jr. That came out in the 70s, where he actually blames Christianity for the ecological crisis because of what you're saying, that, for much of at least the, human history dominated by a Christian worldview, that people were used to seeing, humanity at the pinnacle of creation, at the center of creation, and instrumentalizing the rest of creation for human interest and comfort, convenience, and profit. And so, after the 70s, you do see a little bit more, I think, an intentional word selection by some of the popes who are trying to change that anthropocentric worldview into something that actually tries to be more service oriented. And that's where you start to get language of stewardship. In 1990, Pope John Paul II said that care for creation is an essential dimension of Christian discipleship. Not optional, but the way that we love God is by how we care for creation. And he said that back in 1990. So really, since then, there's been a pretty significant shift. And when he was elected Pope in 2005, Pope Benedict XVI he was known as the Green Pope because of all the ways that he started to really emphasize care for creation as an indispensable way that we care for our neighbor and care and honor the Creator. And that'll be something that we focus on in our last session 2 weeks from now, looking together at the principle of solidarity and care for creation. Although I don't want to dwell on it too long, because I know Maria has Paul Schutz at Santa Clara lined up for our series on Laudato Si, and there's so much. I mean, Laudato Si is a really rich encyclical, and there's a lot there to look at. What does it mean to take this integrated view of creation seriously, and to think about not only how do we love our current neighbors, but our future neighbors, thinking about the condition of creation we'll leave to them. So thinking about solidarity intergenerationally. Okay, so I appreciate hearing from everybody. I would like to hear from you again. So I asked you to spend a little bit of time with these two, very familiar stories, as Lois pointed out. These are stories we know well, but knowing that we were going to focus on the preferential option for the poor, what stood out? So I appreciate, if you want to use the chat feature or raise your hand and share with us, what were things that you noticed that you thought made these stories especially relevant for trying to understand the content and the significance of the preferential option for the poor? How about let's start with the story of the Samaritan. I would wager it's Jesus' best known story. I think everyone pretty much knows what it means to be Good Samaritan, whether or not they're religious. You see Good Samaritan on the names of soup kitchens and hospitals, right? Even, as someone who visits ESPN every now and again. I've seen Good Samaritan in the headlines at ESPN because someone pulled over and helped someone on the roadside. Cecilia, what did you notice?
Well, I have to say I cheated.
Okay.
And I opened it's a Latin American Bible. And it says it's translated, presented, and commentated by the communities of Christian communities in Latin America looking for God. And the interesting thing, and I just loved it, is they looked at the Good Samaritan as a mindset. And they didn't look at it, who, because they began with the question that Jesus asked, who is my neighbor? And then they looked at it and they said, we're looking at it, it's more than just doing an act. It's more than just responding, but it's taking the whole picture and doing, responding without reserve, being always open to the next, whatever is coming, and being risking to what will come. And then they went into Martin Luther King. I mean, this book is filled with absolutely, and right here we have Martin Luther King. These pictures in, they've got all these are all the saints of today's saints. Wait a minute. Can you imagine? These are the Bibles and the saints for Latin America. Like I said, this is all in Spanish. And what did they say? What did Martin Luther King come out and say? And he looked at it, he said, if you're just responding to what has to be done, you're not loving. And so you have to be open and take in everyone and have a big enough heart to embrace. So what he's saying is all these little picky little laws don't matter. The thing is, what is your mindset and where do you see the need and be willing to respond? And he said, who was the Samaritans? They're the strangers. For the Jews, they were the heretics. And yet they took charge of what had to be done. And that's what the whole force for Latin America is, let's step in, not wait, and get things together as a community. The whole thrust is always communities working as communities to make a better world. Like I said,
thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. You raised two really important points there. The first is the question of moral perception, right? Like the Samaritan is able to see the man beaten, robbed, and left for dead, and to tune into his needs, which is so different than the priest and the Levite who can't be bothered, right? Like the text actually points out that they see the man who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead, and they go to the other side of the road. They create more distance between themselves and the robber's victim. So they become, literally the anti-neighbor. Neighbor comes from the word to be nearby, right? So they create more distance, whereas the Samaritan has this moral perception. He really can use his eyes to look for need and to be attentive and responsive to it. And then he draws near. He goes into the ditch. And he takes up the vantage point of the person who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. Incredible vulnerability, right? Martin Luther King spent a lot of time with this passage, and one of the things that he would point out that I think is lost on us because we're so far removed from this story is that this is the only story that has a geographic location. It's the only parable where Jesus gives us a location. And that's not by accident. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously unsafe because Jericho was a center of commerce and Jerusalem was a center of religion. And so you have people going back and forth, but if they were going to Jericho, it meant they were going there to spend money. So they had money on them. And this road, there's a change in elevation of more than 2,000 feet in a very short distance. Jerusalem's a city on a hill. So there are all these switchback turns on this road. And so it was, you didn't have great visibility. And so robbers knew people were carrying money and they knew there wasn't great visibility. So what happens? Well, people get jumped, they get ambushed. So when Jesus is telling this story, Jesus' audience has zero sympathy for the man who's beaten, robbed, and left for dead. He was an idiot to travel this road by himself. So they're sitting there very smugly saying, yeah, he got what he deserved, right? But the Samaritan, he's not sitting there in judgment. His perception is still attuned in. And the second point that you raised that was really important, Cecilia, is that for us in this modern retelling of the story is, we hear Good Samaritan and we know here comes the hero. But for Jesus' audience, the Samaritan was the most despised outcast Jesus' audience could conceive. You know, biblical scholars point out that if the man who was beaten, robbed, and left for dead were conscious, he would have preferred death to have been helped by a Samaritan. So when we read this story, we have to think of someone who makes our skin crawl. I mean, you just have to think of the person or the group of persons that you absolutely despise. And then we can begin to understand the bitter enmity that existed between Jews and Samaritans, which makes this story utterly shocking. I mean, this is the absolute last person Jesus' audience would have imagined would be the hero of this story. And Kathleen Lynch Gaffney, I see in the chat you added this comment that what you noticed was the deeply personal nature of encounter is what caused the change. I love that. Yeah, I've heard so many homilies that excuse the priest and the Levite who say, well, you know, they were busy or they had to stay ritually pure so that they could attend to their responsibilities to the temple, as if the Samaritan didn't also have an agenda or a family that was expecting him or a family that was really worried about him. What was going to happen to him being this despised outcast traveling on this terribly unsafe road? But the Samaritan has this visceral connection, right? The text in the Greek says, and Maria, if you want to chime in here, I know you're the biblical scholar here, so if you want to, you know, illuminate this text even more, go for it. But the Greek word is his bowels were wrenched or his heart was melting. In the English text, it says he's moved with pity, which is such a terrible translation. In the ancient world, they believed that actually the center of the human being, the center of the human person was in the gut, you know? So it's this visceral human connection. Kathleen, you've got it exactly right. The Samaritan spies this person who looks down on him with contempt and scorn and disdain. And he doesn't see any room for judgment, any room to let himself off the hook, you know, all the ways that we justify or rationalize why we don't help other people. It is a deeply personal and visceral human connection which moves him into the ditch. Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I'm really glad you shared that. Lois, what did you notice?
Well, I think it's a lot like what you were just saying about it. And I guess what I was thinking is, you know, I use this in my own teaching as an important story to tell in talking about Catholic social teaching. And I think that you kind of really explained it, that I would almost say, like, for in our modern time right now, our contemporary time, when you're talking to students about it, they might know the expression, the Good Samaritan, like, but they don't know the story. And they have no idea of the depth of the meaning of it, I would say. And that, so it's sort of been neutered in the modern times, and that people think, you know, you have a flat tire and a guy comes by and helps you out, or, you know, you fell down and somebody helps you stand up, or, but this is such a deeper and perilous thing to have done. As you described it, he put himself in danger to do this. I mean, when you were just saying it now, it made me think, right, if the guy who we don't know his name, he doesn't have a title, right? But the guy who's the victim in this story was on this road and people would have no pity for him, whatever, you know, he had money and he should have known better. But that means the Samaritan we know had money. He had resources. He said he was on that road too. But I think I just feel it's a really extra step to get people in the contemporary time for us to understand the deeper meaning of this. It's not just, oh, he's a nice guy and he helped him, you know? And I think that's there's a lot there that you got to really get at and help people understand, you know, the text in a different way.
Yeah, thanks, Lois. Yeah, there are three things in particular I was hoping that you would notice or that we could talk a little bit about together. The first is to pay attention to how the question is framed, or how the story is framed, right? The lawyer is posing a question to Jesus and trying to challenge him, you know, but this question that spurs the whole story is the most important question a Jewish person could ask. What must I do to inherit eternal life? This isn't, you know, one question among others. This is the question. How do I inherit eternal life? And I think this is fascinating because Jesus actually returns the question back to the lawyer. We talked a couple of weeks back about the way that Jesus, empowered the blind man Bartimaeus by asking him, what do you want me to do for you? Right? Like, Jesus doesn't presume to know. Jesus asked the lawyer, you are an expert in the Torah. You tell me what it means to inherit eternal life. And the lawyer does something totally novel, something that we don't see anywhere else in scripture. He takes the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:5, which should be on the lips of a pious Jew at all times, right? Love the Lord with all your strength, with all your heart, with all your soul, right? And then he takes the command from Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself, and he puts them together as one commandment. This doesn't happen anywhere else. In Matthew and Mark's gospel, we have the great commandment, which is to love God. And then Jesus says there's a second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, but there's a separation. The lawyer puts together Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18, and he makes it one commandment, which I love, right? Like, this is only possible because of this encounter that Jesus empowers this lawyer, even though the lawyer is trying to trip him up and trick him and say, okay, where do you stand relative to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? Like, Jesus is gentle and tender and respectful and actually empowers this person. And what happens? We have this new invention, this new great commandment that puts love of God and love of neighbor on equal footing. I think it's interesting to point out too, in the Gospel of John, there's no commandment to love God. It's just Jesus saying, I give you a new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. So the lawyer's a little bit embarrassed, right? Because Jesus says, okay, yeah, do this and you will live. So it's not about the knowing, it's about the doing. So the lawyer's proud of himself. Look what I did here, right? Put together Deuteronomy 6:5, Leviticus 19:18. I came up with this new commandment, and Jesus is nonplussed. Yeah, okay, smarty pants, great answer, but do it. It's about the doing. And then because the lawyer's a little bit embarrassed, he asks this question, who is my neighbor? Which again, because we've heard the story so many times, I think we just think, all right, yeah, I know what's happening here. But listen to that question, who is my neighbor? What do you notice? It's a limit-seeking question, right? It implies there is a non-neighbor. There is someone I am not obligated to care for, right? It reminds me of when I was doing driver's ed in high school, and the police officer came to talk to us about rules of the road, and we could ask him whatever question we wanted. And, our first question was, how fast can I go over the speed limit before I'm going to get pulled over? Limit-seeking question. Or my students, is this going to be on the test? Limit-seeking question, right? Like, what do I have to worry about? What don't I have to worry about? Right? When I was a youth minister for 4 years before I left for grad school, and so often I'd get a question from a teenager, how far can I go with my boyfriend or my girlfriend before it's a sin? Limit-seeking question, right? Like, we are hardwired to want to know how much or how little can we get away with, which is exactly what the lawyer is doing. And Jesus blows up that way of thinking. I mean, he just destroys it. Right? Because if you notice, at the end of the story, Jesus returns the question back to the lawyer. And instead of it being, a neighbor who's an object unto me, someone that I'm obligated to care for or serve, Jesus changes the question to who was neighbor to the man who was beaten, robbed, and left for dead. So now the neighbor is the proactively loving subject. So who is my neighbor is exactly the wrong question to ask. Jesus is saying, we should instead be asking ourselves, what kind of neighbor am I and to whom? So that was the first thing that I wanted you to spend time with. The second thing comes from Gustavo Gutierrez. Gustavo points out that the man who's beaten, robbed, and left for dead is the only person that doesn't really get much of a description. And yet, as Gustavo points out, he is the center of the story because every other character is related to him, right? The story orbits around him, even though he's beaten, robbed, and left for dead. And Gustavo points out that this is the quintessential poor person. And it's because we're talking about the preferential option for the poor tonight, I have to clarify that when we're talking about the poor in Catholic social teaching, we're not only talking about a socioeconomic class. For Catholic social teaching, the poor, building on this biblical understanding, the poor are the outcasts. They are the powerless. They are, in the words of Gustavo Gutierrez, the socially insignificant. You know, Gustavo, as I told you before, you know, that remembering that story about, you know, growing up in the slums of Lima, Peru, and his dad being a day laborer who would sometimes bring him home ice cream. And Gustavo says, this is exactly how God is with us, that God wants to spoil us and delights in us and doesn't just give us the rice and beans that we need, right? For Gustavo, the poor who experience poverty face premature death. That poverty is against life. And so that's true in an economic sense, but for Gustavo, when we think about the poor, we have to think about the marginalized and the excluded in every form. So anyone who's rendered socially insignificant or invisible, the unheard and the unseen, the people who are made to feel that they should question if they count, matter, or belong. And I think that's really important. And that's why I wanted you to spend time with this story, because for Gustavo, the point of this story is to imagine ourselves in it and to think about the ways in which we're like the priest and the Levite, where, you know, we can't be bothered to help someone else because we're just so consumed with our agenda. Or today, boy, I think it would be easy to come up with a parallel story today and think about, you know, with our phones, just how many people would be utterly distracted who would never notice the man who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. Or we're so busy, or life feels like it's just moving so fast that we would zoom right by this person in the ditch. And, you know, we should think about the ways that we're the Samaritan. And you know, as Lois points out, he has money on him and he risks a lot going into that ditch. He didn't know that this wasn't an ambush. And he risks a lot going into the inn. Can you imagine what that was like for him as a despised outcast walking into that inn with a hurt Jew on his animal? I mean, it would be like in the 1800s if a Plains Indian walked in with a scalped cowboy on his horse and said, you know, I'm walking into a saloon and, you know, surrounded by cowboys and saying, here, you know, I'll pay for his care, his convalescence for 2 weeks. I mean, that Plains Indian would have been lucky to get out alive. So incredible courage on the part of the Samaritan. But we should also think about ourselves as the innkeeper, you know, the times in which other people have tried to enlist us in care and being part of that chain of care, and to make it sustainable. The Samaritan goes on his way. He returns to his family. He doesn't quit his job and abandon his family and try to build the Jericho Road Improvement Society. You know, that's how Martin Luther King used to preach this passage. But for Gustavo, we should also think about what it's like to be in that ditch, you know, to take up the vantage point of the insignificant person, the outcast, the one that people are walking past, who feel invisible. And what is it like to experience the powerlessness of the poor? I have to say, for me, this took on a really deep meaning when I spent time at a mustard seed community in Kingston, Jamaica, that was being run by Sisters of Charity. And they had taken in children with physical and cognitive disabilities who had been discarded by their family members. Their family members couldn't provide for them. And so these Sisters of Charity would take in these children. And I remember showing up as a 22-year-old college student who wanted to make a difference and help out and make sure that I had this lasting impression on all these kids that I felt so sorry for, and was very glad that I wasn't them. And these Sisters of Charity saw me. They looked me up and down. They saw that I was 6'5", and most of them were 4'5", and I thought they were going to put me to work. Give me a can of paint and let me paint your ceiling. I can reach places you'll never dream of reaching. Let me lift heavy furniture. And instead, they actually asked me to go and spend some time with this little boy named Andrew, who is suffering from hydrocephaly, which I didn't know at the time, but hydrocephaly is a condition when the fluid collects on the brain. And so Andrew's body was, his head was the size of a watermelon, and the rest of his body was smaller than his head. He didn't have the strength to lift his head. So his entire life, he was confined to a crib. And he just laid on his back, staring up at the sky. And they asked me to visit with him, and I did for a couple minutes. He was nonverbal, so he couldn't hold a conversation. So I just had to sit there and talk to him. So I tried to look around and talk about things that I could see that maybe he couldn't see, or talk about what the other children were doing. And after 5 minutes, that felt like 60 minutes, I went back to the orderlies and I said, okay, I visited with Andrew. What do you want me to do next? And they said, no, that's what we want you to do today. You know, we have way too many children to care for. We can't possibly sit there and visit with Andrew as long as he deserves. So we just would like you to do that. And I really had a hard time drawing my chair back next to Andrew's crib and figuring out what else to talk about. And I started telling him a little bit about my life and anything that came to mind. And eventually I tracked down a karaoke machine and tried to sing, and then people begged me to stop singing, so I did. And I had no idea what else to talk about. So I went back to the orderlies after another maybe 10 minutes that had felt like 3 hours. And I said, okay, I'm done visiting with Andrew, put me to work. And I'm embarrassed that I couldn't sit there. I couldn't look into Andrew's eyes and think about what it was like to exist in that condition of powerlessness, to be so utterly helpless. I couldn't sit there and think about why him and not me. And to really take to heart that his life had just as much dignity, that he was just as precious in God's eyes as I was. I was so convinced that my value was linked to doing that I just kept bugging the nuns, put me to work, let me help. And eventually they relented. I mean, they could tell I couldn't sit there and visit with Andrew. And I've always regretted that I didn't have the patience. I didn't have the compassion. I really didn't have the solidarity to just be with Andrew and share life with him. And if you did have a chance to look up that article that I highlighted for you from Gustavo Gutierrez, he really sits with this passage and goes a little bit beyond it. And he says that really the preferential option for the poor is not just about going into the ditch and taking the vantage point of the one who's been beaten, robbed, or left for dead, you know, the insignificant or the vulnerable or the excluded. It's ultimately about cultivating friendship with the poor. For him, that's what the preferential option is all about. It's about friendship with the poor. And I failed at that with Andrew. And what makes me remember the story all the more is when I was a couple years later, when I was at Boston College, actually 2 of my classmates were orderlies who worked at that mustard seed community. And they recounted to me some years later that actually Andrew died in a hurricane, that hurricane ripped through Kingston, Jamaica, and they weren't able to rescue all of the children before the hurricane hit. And Andrew was among those children that they just didn't have the capacity to try to save before the hurricane wiped through. So his precious little life snuffed out, you know, extinguished at such a young and tender age. It makes me regret all the more that I couldn't just be with him and honor his dignity with my presence. I mean, it's not much to give, but just to show him that he is worth my time. And I think that's really what the story of the Samaritan invites all of us to do, is to think about, yes, the courage of the Samaritan, yes, the compassion of the Samaritan, that he has this visceral human connection. Yes, you know, the generosity of the Samaritan, that he does provide assistance, you know, on site, and then enough to pay for his convalescence for 2 weeks, and the promise to return and cover anything that remains in the tab. But also the humility of the Samaritan, right? The Samaritan does have an agenda. He does have a family. He has business to attend to, and he puts the brakes on all that, and he goes into the ditch because he knows that attending to this person's wounds is more important than what he had going on, than even his own safety and security. And I think that requires incredible humility. Aquinas tells us that humility is telling the truth about ourselves. It's not humiliation, right? It's seeing the good in and around us and realizing the good that we can do, no more and no less. And what I love about this story is that it's a story about fidelity. Jews and Samaritans hated each other, and yet the Samaritan's moral perception was able to cut through and see, you might hate me and my family. You might want me dead. You might want nothing to do with me, but I know there is good that I can do to try to save your life. There's a fidelity there that I think we so sorely need right now in our deeply divided and distrustful social context, right? I mean, even Lois, you said, I think a little bit ago, I don't want to get political. Or no, maybe Arlene, it was you. I don't want to get political with the Build Back Better, issues, but boy, we need to rekindle that sense of belonging to each other. It makes me think of that line from Mother Teresa: if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. The Samaritan story reminds us that we belong to each other, and that's what Jesus expects of us. And so that gets us to that third point that I wanted us to really sit with. How does Jesus end the story? He says, go and do likewise. I love that. The likewise is inviting us to imagine, what does it mean for me to be like the Samaritan? It's not go and do exactly the same. He's not giving us a one-size-fits-all approach. He's not saying every time you encounter someone in need, regardless of the circumstances, you have to help. Jesus is saying, you have a brain, you have a conscience, you have a heart. Use those to figure out how you can model the Samaritan's courage, compassion, humility, generosity, and fidelity. How can you be the kind of Samaritan-like neighbor that you see in this story? And, to think about, how do we become a Samaritan-like community or Samaritan-like church, right? To think about this on the social level or the institutional level and not just on the personal level. That doing likewise, that's a gift and it's a task, right? We have to think about how we can do the good where we can and do that good, that we're able to do no more and no less. Maria, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you just mentioned the words, not just on an individual level, but an institutional level. The other thing I think about this text is that, the priest and the Levite represent the religious officials of their day, the people steeped in religion. And I just can't help thinking that it's a little bit of a reflection of the fact that sometimes religion can become, and with its distinctions, rubrics, structures, you mentioned at the beginning they couldn't stop to being pure. How religion, with all of its categories and its limitations, can sometimes become the thing that separates us from people, whereas the Samaritan is other, not part of the religious establishment. And I think that's an important thing to point out in this text.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. And let's be clear, right? The Mishnah makes it an imperative that if you encounter a corpse, you have to cover the corpse to show respect for the dead, right? The priest and the Levite were absolutely obligated to go into the ditch. I mean, they had no excuse by religion or any other rationale not to go into the ditch. And they didn't even check to see if he was dead, right? Because they go farther away from him. So they fail in their moral and religious responsibility. And I don't want to be anti-Semitic, because sometimes this text can be used to really cast aspersions on the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day. But your point is well taken, Maria, that there are a lot of people who use their religion to justify not showing compassion to other people or not being morally courageous or to betray solidarity, and I think it's important to point out anytime we use religion to create a dividing line, Jesus is on the other side of that line. Okay, so we've also got this Matthew 25 story, which again, I imagine very familiar to all of us. And the point that I wanted to just make sure that everyone got to spend some time with there is that this is a criterion for salvation, criterion singular, right? The sheep don't know their sheep, the goats don't know their goats. But how are they saved? It's not by what they believed, right? It's not that the sheep were Jews and the goats were Gentiles. It's not how often they went to temple. It's not how much they gave to the temple, right? What makes a sheep is, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, giving drink to the thirsty, visiting the imprisoned, welcoming the stranger, right? All these corporal works of mercy that you see on the screen. That's what makes the sheep the sheep. And they're like, Jesus, what are you talking about, right? They say, we have no idea. When were you naked or a stranger or in jail? And Jesus says, what you do for the least of your brothers and sisters, you do for me. And then he turns to the goats and they're like, surely if we had known it was you, Lord, we would have, given you food or drink or visited you, right? And Jesus says, what you do not do for the least of your brothers and sisters, you do not do for me. So I think that's really important, because there are a lot of people who think the preferential option for the poor, because it's really not a phrase that appears until the 1960s, that this again is something that's being added on to scripture rather than coming out of scripture. So I just wanted to highlight a couple biblical resources so that we can make clear. In the Theology of Liberation that Gustavo Gutierrez publishes, there are almost 400 references to scripture in that text. This is a deeply biblical vision of what it means to be in right relationship with God and one another. So just a couple examples here, right? Like I mentioned, I had the great privilege of taking class with Gustavo Gutierrez, and he starts class with Deuteronomy 15. There's this passage right here about not hardening your heart to anyone who's in need in your community. And if there is anyone in need in your community, it is expected that you give generously and share what you have with them. And I think it's worth pointing out, I learned from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that in the Hebrew scriptures, the command to love your neighbor as yourself is repeated 2 times, but the command to love the stranger, the widow, the orphan, those who were the outcasts, the powerless, the vulnerable, the ones that the Hebrew people assumed they really didn't owe anything to and couldn't be bothered with, that command to care for them is repeated 36 times. Right. So there is a partiality to the most vulnerable, the excluded, that I think, we all grew up learning, love your neighbor as yourself. I don't know how many of us knew about this, extra emphasis, 18 times as often, that we have to think about our fidelity to the covenant with Yahweh and to the people of God is measured by how we treat the most vulnerable among us. And then we've got the Magnificat, right? Like Mary's song in Luke 1. I have the image on the left-hand screen here from Ben Wildflower. If you read the Magnificat, boy, if you are a wealthy person, if you're an elite, if you're a powerful person, you should be worried. That Mary talks about casting down the mighty and sending the rich away, that this is how her soul glorifies the Lord. This is a subversive text that really, kind of coheres with this core theme in scripture, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And that where is God? Among the outcast, the ones who are considered unworthy or impure. And as we talked about already, right? Like this Jewish lawyer poses this question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, Jesus says, go and do likewise. It's about the doing. It's not about the knowing, which is what we also see in Matthew 25. Cecilia, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yes, I do. I brought a picture of Vincent de Paul.
Oh, yeah.
Who happens to be our patron. And his law to all of us is to consider the poor our masters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's a whole different way of working with the poor, when you consider their options are important, and it's not your agenda.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great way to think about the asymmetries of power, and to think about how we are accountable to the poor. I mean, I always think about that with the story I shared with Andrew. If he had my life, what would he be doing with it? And what would he want me to be doing for other people like Andrew, because of the privilege and power that I enjoy? I thought too, these 2 lines are worth sharing with you. I don't know if you've had the chance to read Gustavo Gutierrez's book on Job. It's his favorite book. I got to drive him to the airport once, and I was asking him, of all the things you've written, what's your favorite? And he talks about that book that he wrote on Job. He said it's like poetry. And this is one of the lines at the very end of that book on Job. He says, the prophet Isaiah announces that the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces. So Gustavo says, well, if that's true, if Isaiah says that God will wipe away tears from all faces, then what will it be like for those who never cried, who never suffered with, who never had compassion? So Gustavo says, woe to those whom the Lord finds dry-eyed, because they could not bring themselves to solidarity with the poor and suffering of this world. which I love. I mean, I think, what did Andrew want? He just wanted me to share life with him. He wanted me to cry with him or to rejoice with him, right? Like he just wanted me to see him as an equal, not to feel sorry for him or to, to be uncomfortable in sitting with him or to be focused, to only see his disability and to not see him. And so I really think that's the invitation here is to see the poor as our equals. So I would challenge that idea of seeing the poor as our masters a little bit, because I think that only reinforces a power asymmetry. But, for Aristotle, fidelity or friendship requires equality, and to see ourselves on equal footing and to say, all right, how do we build mutual respect and reciprocity and mutuality so that we can create power sharing models and not power over top-down hegemonic power structures. And then, this line from Dorothy Day, the gospel takes away our right forever, to think about categories of the poor or the undeserving poor. There's no ability to discriminate. And I think of all the times people have really kind of let themselves off the hook because of the way they see the poor. They think of the poor as lazy or entitled. I mean, I actually really detest the way that assistance is described. Public assistance is described as entitlements. Like you have people just sitting on a couch wanting to just be provided for. Gustavo points out, well, all the poor want is to be agents of their own future. That's it. They want to have a say in their future. And going back to what I think Lois, you shared, or no, it was Arlene, you're talking about the charity. That charity model just fosters dependency, right? It just trains us to see the poor as waiting on us to be generous with them, and that they just have to wait around, until the government provides them an entitlement or generous individuals offer some assistance. And so I think, if we take seriously that we don't have this right to discriminate between the deserving and the undeserving poor, then the alternative is what Dorothy Day called the duty of delight, to delight in other people, to see them as God sees them and to see them as our equals, and then to be friends and collaborators, partners in mission for a world that looks totally different than the way that it is with its unjust inequalities. So to get to what is the content of the preferential option for the poor, as you may have noticed, for John Paul II, it's a special form of primacy in the exercise of Christian charity, which he describes in those earlier paragraphs 11 and 12, and then later on, not till paragraph 58, does he talk about it is part of how we meet the basic requirements of justice. It is how we build a just society, and that the health of our society is measured by the well-being of the most vulnerable among us. But I think even before Centesimus Annus, which doesn't come out until 91, we see in Vatican II a lot of emphasis on a church that is for the poor and should be on the side of the poor. I mean, even before Vatican II, John the 23rd said he wanted a church that was poor and for the poor. And he said that in a radio address in 1961. I think it was 61. It might have been 62. But in any event, right, John the 23rd had this vision of a church that really put the needs of the poor first. And, one of the most powerful experiences of my life was getting to visit the house where Oscar Romero lived. It was a house that was built for him by these nuns who knew that he would never accept his own private residence. I don't know if you knew this, but Archbishop Romero was living on a cot in the sacristy of a tiny little chapel in a cancer hospital. He didn't even have a home. He didn't have a place to welcome any guests. He refused to live in the Archbishop's palace in San Salvador. And so these nuns who were taking care of these cancer patients in a hospital in San Salvador, they built this tiny little, very modest home that only had 3 rooms. It had a bedroom, a bathroom, and then a place where he could welcome guests. And there was actually a hammock that Romero could lie in and read books. Very, very simple home. And and they knew he wouldn't accept this house, even though it was, teeny tiny. So they had the hospital patients present it to him as a birthday present. And how could Oscar Romero say no to a present from cancer patients? So he accepted it. But when you get to visit Romero's home, you get to see his own photographs and you get to see his bishop's mitre. And as you may know, Romero's bishop mitre reads "Sentir con la Iglesia," which means feel with the church. He gets that right from Vatican II. And these paragraphs that I've highlighted for you in Ad Gentes, that the church sees itself as a sacrament of solidarity, especially with the poor and the vulnerable. My favorite picture of Romero is on the wall of his home. And it's Romero as the Archbishop sitting in the grass on the side of the road with a tamale in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, surrounded by a bunch of Salvadorans. And I did a triple take. I had never in my life seen an Archbishop sitting in the grass, just shooting the breeze with the people. But before our session started, Cecilia was sharing that she went back to some of her documents from Latin America. And this is a teología del pueblo, a theology of the people. And this is what we get. And the preferential option for the poor comes from, really, it comes from the Latin American church. The credit goes to Pedro Arrupe, the superior general of the Jesuits. He coins this phrase in 1968 in one of his letters. If you have a chance to read the essential writings of Pedro Arrupe, which is a book published by Orbis, it is absolutely beautiful. It's one of my prized possessions. And Arrupe talks about, to be a Christian is to be a person for others, to orient your life for others, and especially for the poor. And he talks about how the church needs to have this preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable. And that comes out of Arrupe's own experience. He was trained as a medical doctor, and then he left in medicine to become a priest. And he was actually working in the Jesuit novitiate in Hiroshima the day that the atomic bomb was dropped in August of 1945. And because of his medical training, he ran into Hiroshima to provide whatever medical assistance he could to the people there. And he writes in his diary about taking tweezers and pulling out shards of glass out of the blistered skin of the citizens of Hiroshima, and talking about how this was the darkest moment in the history of humanity, that one nation could do this to civilians of another nation in an instant. And that changed Arrupe's life, and then it changed the Jesuits after that. And it's all about this commitment to justice with a partiality, a preference, a priority for the protectionless. And so, in the middle of the page here, I have some highlights from this Episcopal Conference of Latin America, which is abbreviated as CELAM. If you have a chance to read any of those documents from Medellin in 68, Puebla in 79, Santo Domingo in 92, or Aparecida in 2007, they're absolutely beautiful. And my favorite is Aparecida, which Gustavo had a hand in helping to write, talking about the preferential option for the poor as a call to look upon the faces of the poor. I think too often we think of the poor as just these masses of people who are living in poverty. And there's this beautiful book that I have here that was written by John Kavanaugh with pictures from Mev Paleo. It's called Faces of Poverty, Faces of Christ. And I don't know that it's still in print, but it was published by Orbis. And I bought this when I was in college, and it's just incredible, the pictures of the poor just in their everyday life. And it's an invitation to see the poor as a sacrament, to see them in their dignity, to not be filled with pity for them, right? The poor don't want us to just feel sorry for them and just think of them as just dependent and waiting for us to show them a modicum of generosity or giving from our surplus. They want us to recognize them as equals, and to be shoulder to shoulder and working for their good, so that they can be agents of their own future. So I just have a couple highlights here from some of these documents. I think the first quote is from Santo Domingo in paragraph 178, the suffering faces of the poor, the suffering faces of Christ, a reference back to Matthew 25:40, that we should see ourselves as traveling companions of our poorest brothers and sisters, even as far as martyrdom, invoking the example of people like Romero or the Uca martyrs or the churchwoman killed in December of 1980. I don't know if you've seen the film Roses in December, but it's such a beautiful movie about those North American churchwomen who were raped and killed in El Salvador in December of 1980. But invoking this example of just accompanying the poor and experiencing their powerlessness. That means so much with my experience with Andrew, just having a taste, even for a couple minutes, of what it's like to be powerless and not having any say over my future. And these Latin American bishops say that the preferential option means that it should permeate all of our pastoral structures and priorities, that this isn't something on the side, that this should really be our compass, our true north. And as I've pointed out, for Gustavo, the preferential option for the poor at bottom means going out of our way into the ditch, taking the vantage point of the outcast, making it our own to see what we see, because what we see depends on where we're standing and with whom, and ultimately to cultivate friendship with the poor and excluded. Because when we have friends who are poor, when they're people who have been excluded or marginalized, their problems become our problems. It makes us put some skin in the game. So we can't just pray for the poor or talk about the poor. We have to name the poor. We have to see their faces. We have to care about them as we would our friends. Now, I want to make the case too that this is a natural connection to this call for racial justice. If you had time, I invited you to spend part of this last week with Bishop Mark Seitz, the Bishop of El Paso, with this pastoral letter that came out in 2019 after the shooting that happened there, that targeted immigrants, from Central America. And there are some really powerful lines here. I think Bishop Seitz gives us a great gift that's way better than anything we've gotten from the USCCB. There are two pastoral letters on racism, one from 79 and one from 2018, but neither address white privilege or white supremacy. They don't talk about racism as a social sin. I think they really kind of let a lot of Christians think about racism as personal ignorance or bias or fear, but we don't think about racism as historical, as cultural, as geographical, or as institutional. And so what I really appreciate about this document is, it challenges us to see that it's not enough not to be racist. We have to be anti-racist. We have to be actively against the systems and structures that benefit white people at the expense of people of color, because that's what racism really is, right? That it means that white people have unearned benefits and privileges by virtue of our ethnicity, and it comes at the expense, because of the exploitation, the denial of the dignity and rights and privileges of people of color. So you can see here, right, like this is part of what Bishop Seitz is talking about, what it means for us to really respond to the ways in which racism advances, shores up, and just creates a system of oppression based on skin color. And this is, flies in the face of what we see in Scripture, where, for example, in the letter to the Galatians, there is no longer slave nor free person, Jew or Greek, male or female, all are one in Christ. We get over and again this vision of being one body, where there should be no divisions between people by race or ethnicity. And I have to say, this is a touchy subject, right? There are a lot of people who feel very, fragile and uncomfortable. There's a lot of guilt and unease around this conversation. People can get very angry and defensive. And I think that's part of the problem, because when racism comes up, it caters around the feelings of white people and their discomfort around this topic. And I think, again, that's why the story of the Samaritan is such a natural fit, right? The Samaritan surrenders all of that protection, all of that security, and goes into the ditch and takes up the vantage point of the person beaten, robbed, and left for dead. And I think most white people in this country have no idea what it's like to be a person of color. And in fact, in the research I was doing for my book on the ethics of encounter, I found that 75% of white Americans don't have a single Black friend, and 2/3 of African Americans don't have a single white friend. So we really have lost any real understanding of what it means to be someone other than me, and what it's like to experience racial profiling, or to be denied a bank loan, or to not have, the fear and trepidation of what happens when you get pulled over by a police officer, and worry, could this be it? Could I not make it home safely? So I really appreciate not only the way that Bishop Seitz denounces racism, but he also he announces what we need to do. We have to work against dehumanization and forge a new humanity. What racism has divided, with the help of God, we can work to restore. And I think for a lot of us, because we're uncomfortable with this topic, or there is a lot of white guilt and white obliviousness. I think for a lot of white people just don't understand racism as systematic, as historical, as geographical, as institutional. They just want to stay out of it, right? Like stay on the sidelines. And so I wanted to invoke here these two lines from two of my teachers. When I was at Marquette, I got to spend time with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he points out, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. The Archbishop says, if an elephant is standing on the tail of a mouse, your neutrality does nothing to help that mouse. And I also had the great privilege of taking class with Elie Wiesel, who you may know was, a Holocaust survivor. He taught a class at Boston University on reconciliation. And he would point out, always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And so I think that this is part of what, it doesn't exist yet, this principle of racial justice, but I think it needs to exist so that the Catholic Church can go from benefiting from white supremacy and white privilege, or being ambivalent about it, to being actively anti-racist. So to get to some implications and applications, on the left, to be a little lighthearted about it, I have this quote from Stephen Colbert. If this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, or doesn't address racism, either we have to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and admit we just don't want to do it. Which I think, he said that a number of years ago on the Colbert Report,
Right.
That he used to host. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, we talk about this as a Christian nation, but boy, I don't know how well we actually live up to the example Jesus has given us in the Gospels. I always think of that line from Gandhi, when he was asked, why aren't you a Christian? And he said, I like your Christ, but I do not like your Christians because they are not like your Christ. And I think too, this image in the middle here, a lot of people don't understand why we're still talking about racism. And it's because we haven't satisfactorily, adequately addressed the legacy, the ways in which our country has been founded on white racism, anti-Black racism in particular, but racism and white supremacy. So if you look at the history of our country, founded on hundreds of years of slavery, 90 years of segregation. I think you could argue that segregation really lasted until 1968. So 54 might be a little bit premature. But then this legacy of mass incarceration. In this country, we spend more money on prisons than we do on schools. And if you haven't seen this documentary from Netflix, it's actually available on YouTube, so you don't need Netflix to watch it. It is powerful, but it's about the 13th Amendment that really kind of changed segregation and refashioned it so that it became this model of mass incarceration that disproportionately targets communities of color. And going back to that point about families, Mary Beth, I appreciated you sharing that story about visiting Cambodia and seeing how the sweatshops are so disruptive to family structures. That's absolutely true. There are all these studies about women in Asia who go off to be caretakers in other parts of the world, and then have to hire someone to look after their own children, or have to have an aunt or a grandmother look after children. If we look at mass incarceration and the way in which that has disrupted the family structure in this country, it is heartbreaking how many children, we're talking about millions of children in this country who have one or both parents who are incarcerated. So addressing, this problem of mass incarceration, which is, a uniquely an American problem. So there's some resources here. Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is a great organization. It's a secular one, but it's a good one. It's targeted toward white people, so it's really help us figure out how we can be advocates and allies in the work for racial justice. The Ignatian Solidarity Network has a lot of resources on racial justice. And then Olga Segura, who used to write for America Magazine, she has this great article, How Can Catholics Help Lead the Fight Against Racism? So these are all things that you could Google and learn a little bit more about. So I do want to make time for a little bit of conversation if we have it, but before, since we're at 8:50, I want to make sure that you have these resources for you. So if you haven't read A Theology of Liberation, I would really urge you to. It is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. It is probably my most prized possession because I had Gustavo sign it when I got to help him with a class that he was teaching at BC. It is just absolutely beautiful. And as I mentioned, almost 400 references to scripture, just trying to help us better understand this really extensive biblical witness that calls us to see that our relationship with God is measured by how we treat the most vulnerable among us. Yvonne Gabara is a nun from Brazil who's got a couple really beautiful books about the preferential option for the poor and the principle of solidarity from a feminist perspective. And she does it also in a way that's really informed by indigenous perspectives. She reminds me a lot of Dorothy Stang, who, as you may know, was martyred in the Amazon in 2005 or 2007. It's been a while now, but Yvonne Gabara is just really well respected in her books. I think really help to see how women very often, I mean, when we talk about climate change in 2 weeks, it's important to point out that 80% of the people who are who are impacted the worst by climate change are women and children. I mean, this is disproportionately an attack against women. And so I think to hear from the voices of the poor and especially voices of women is important. John Markey has a great book there in the middle, Moses and Pharaoh's House, that my students really enjoy. It's kind of targeted to a North American audience. It's very accessible. And I've had a number of students say it was a life-changing read for them, just really thinking about what preferential option would look like for most of us who have a pretty comfortable middle-class lifestyle. And then 2 books on racial justice. The classic text that's now 12 years old is Brian Massingale's book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. He was my professor when I was a student at Marquette. And, his point was, don't just talk about racism when I walk into the room, which I really took to heart. If you don't know Brian, he's a Black Catholic priest who is now teaching at Fordham in New York, but really one of the few courageous speakers on the need for us to really take seriously that human dignity and human rights require that we become more anti-racist and confront a legacy of white privilege and white supremacy in the Catholic Church. And his book is really, I think, it really does a beautiful job of weaving in the sacramental life of the church as a way to respond to racism in our communities. And then a new book that just came out by Olga Segura is called Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church, looking at the ways in which Black Catholics have been, a part of our church for a long time and never really recognized. And she does a great job elevating those kinds of examples to help us see the work for racial justice that's been a part of the church, but just not been noticed all that well. So it's a short book, very accessible. She's a great writer, and it's pretty new. So if you haven't had a chance to give it a look, I'd recommend it. Okay, so for next time, our penultimate gathering, we're going to focus on the global common good and the principle of subsidiarity. So looking at the global and the local, which hopefully won't be too taxing for our brains. And here are the readings. You'll see not too much reading for next week. There isn't actually all that much written about the principle of subsidiarity in the magisterial documents. And I just highlighted 2 paragraphs there at the very bottom from Quadragesimo Anno in 1931, so the 40th anniversary document of Rerum Novarum, and Caritas in Veritate by Pope Benedict XVI. They both address how development really needs to begin in the grassroots, which I think is helpful for us to figure out, like, where does this find traction? Where do we begin? And then in terms of the global common good, it has been a point of emphasis in Laudato Si, for sure. Those paragraphs 156 to 159 are excellent. Pope Francis gives us a great vision for what this looks like. And it's also pretty essential to the vision of solidarity that Pope Francis outlines in Fratelli Tutti. And we'll spend more time with the principle of solidarity in our last meeting 2 weeks from now. All right, that gets us across the finish line. Lois, you've been patient. Was there something you wanted to share?
Actually, yeah, I guess I kind of left my hand up there from when you had Bishop Seitz, the excerpts from the pastoral letter in Texas there. I have a sort of a extra fondness for that letter. And I don't often read like Bishop's letters from other dioceses, but I read his because the day of that shooting, it took place in a Walmart in El Paso. And I was in Texas with Catholic Charities working with asylum seekers, and I was in a Walmart in Laredo. And I thought, that guy drove a long way And, could have been any old Walmart. And I thought, I don't know, it just made me feel a connection in an interesting way like that. Well, I'm grateful I wasn't there, but, it could have been that Walmart. It could have been. And I've always felt like I had to pay attention to that letter more than maybe other things, and I think I had another thought too, but I don't remember now. It's a little bit ago. But that was, I guess it's more of an affective mention of that letter. So it's always meant a lot to me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Lois. Anything else that anyone wanted to share or that I can clarify before we sign off for the night? Yeah, Maria.
This is a very minor example, incidental type of example, but in talking about racism, and I had an incident a few years ago. I was going on vacation. It was my last day at work before vacation. I worked till 10 o'clock at night to take care of things. I'm driving home. I was at a stoplight at an intersection. The light turned green. I proceeded forward. And as soon as I did, there were red lights behind me. And I pulled over just thinking the red lights were going to go past. Nope, the red lights stopped behind me. And the police officer walked out, came up to the car, and he started by saying, "How are you doing?" And I said, well, if I had been asked that question a minute ago, the answer would be different. And he laughed. He was light about it. And then he asked if I knew why I was pulled over. I said, I had absolutely no idea. It turned out my headlight was out. So I told him that I had just had a grueling day. I was preparing to go on vacation. And the whole thing ended with him saying, well, when you get back from vacation, just make sure you get that light repaired or replaced right away. So a very incidental, really friendly type of exchange. And I live upstate. I work in Glens Falls. I live in Queensbury. So when I was first stopped, it was by the Glens Falls police. Then as I'm driving into Queensbury, I'm thinking, you know what? I hope I don't get stopped by a Warren County sheriff. Sure enough, red lights behind me again. So I pull over, and this time when the officer comes over and says, do you know why I pulled you over? I said, actually, I do. I was just stopped a few minutes ago in Glens Falls. And he said, well, what did that officer say? And I had told him that again, that I was going on vacation, and that the officer had said to make sure I get the light replaced as soon as I get back. All right, and he says, okay, I'll do the same thing. And so off I go. And again, two rather friendly exchanges. Now, if I had been someone else, maybe it wouldn't have been a friendly exchange. And this was really underscored when I returned from vacation. I came into the Albany airport, and I had, I don't know, an Uber or a Lyft pick me up. And the person who was the driver, I'm not exactly sure where he was from, but he had dark skin and a noticeable accent. And as we're departing from as we're driving out of the airport, but not quite all the way to the road, again, red lights. And this driver gets pulled over. And the exchange was entirely different than my exchange, even to the point that a second policeman came over to the other side of the car. And, so just a very intimidating presentation over what was, again, a minor infraction. I forget what it was, but it was something along the lines of, again, maybe a light being out. And I eventually leaned forward because, this exchange went on for what it seemed to be several minutes. And I thought, well, maybe if he sees me in the back, one of the officers sees me in the back of the car, they'll kind of let it go. That didn't really work. And I was really getting concerned that they might be arresting the driver. And incidentally, I am a lawyer. I don't do criminal work, really. I don't do immigration. But, I was then, the question became, now what do I do? if, because I was really at the point, this had gone on so long, that I was really at the point that I felt, that maybe I should be intervening. But again, way outside my area of exposure and practice. But it just, so that second event, or the third event really, the airport event, just so underscored the difference. I mean, I was very grateful the two police officers who had stopped me were so, again, I'll say friendly. But it was in such such contrast to the experience of the driver who was not a white female or a white person, period.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great example of encounter and what it's like to, to experience life for someone else. I mean, I can't get over all the studies that show that there are a lot of white Americans who think anti-white racism is more of a problem than anti-Black racism in this country. I can only think that's a total lack of understanding what it's like for, the experience of people of color. Yeah. All right, it's 9 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of your time and let you go, but I really appreciate how much we heard from so many people, and hope this will keep the wheels turning in terms of, what Catholic social teaching is inviting us to think and feel and say and do differently. All right, thanks everybody. Take care, and
Good night.
we'll see you
Good night.
next week.
Thanks very much.